Hi everyone, and welcome to our module on the lymphatics of the upper limb. When talking about lymphatics, we talk about another form of vasculature that deals with the passage or transportation of a type of fluid called lymph. So lymph is usually an excess extracellular fluid, usually gotten from blood. So when blood moves through the venous system and the arterial system, some of the blood that is moving through that normal vascular channel is lost in the interstitial space. For us not to have excessive amount of interstitial fluid due to that loss of fluid from the blood vessels, what tends to happen is that we have another extra channel, a third channel that will help in draining out this excess interstitial fluid. And that third channel tends to be the lymphatic channel. The lymphatic channel tends to be composed of lymphatic vessels and lymphatic nodes. We'll talk about that in relation to the upper limb. So as I said, the lymphatic drainage of the upper limb comprises of a combination of lymph vessels and lymph nodes. The vessels tend to be the channels, the vasculatures through which lymph tends to be transported. Lymph nodes are usually stop points where the lymph that is transported tends to be um, filtered, checked for infection, for bacteria, for parasitic infection, for viruses, and that lymph tends to be filtered or quote unquote washed before it is passed on to into the venous system. So lymph that is drained by lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes will eventually end up back in the blood vessels, back in the venous system. Let's start off with the lymphatic vessels found in the upper limb. We have two types of lymphatic vessels in the upper limb, and this tends to mirror what we find in terms of the venous um, drainage of the upper limb. Remember that the venous drainage of the upper limb, we have the superficial and the deep veins of the upper limb. In terms of lymphatic vessels, we also have superficial lymphatic vessels and deep lymphatic vessels of the upper limb. We'll start with the superficial lymphatic vessels. Starting off with the superficial lymphatic vessels of the upper limb. Now, these are lymph vessels that are typically found or located within the skin. They are found subcutaneously, and in terms of its relation to the superficial venous system of the upper limb, superficial veins are going to be running side by side with superficial lymphatic vessels. As I said before, these are vessels that are found within the skin and they would accompany the superficial vein. They tend to begin from the hand and then ascend all the way out to the forearm. Within the forearm, the superficial lymphatic vessels will form two channels. We talk about these channels in terms of how they run and how they terminate. These channels include the ulnar and the radial channels of the superficial lymphatic vessels. As I said in the previous slide, once the superficial lymphatic vessels begin from the hand and run to the forearm, at the forearm, they tend to form two major channels. The channels include the ulnar channel and the radial channel. This is just in relation to their location. The ulnar channels are found closer to the ulnar bone or the ulnar side or the medial side of the forearm. The radial channels are going to be located at the lateral part of the forearm. And they are going to also accompany most of the vessels that we will talk about in terms of the venous drainage of the upper limb. The ulnar channel tends to follow the basilic vein. It follows the basilic vein, which is found medially, and then it runs all the way up to the arm and towards the shoulder. Once it gets towards the shoulder, moving into the axilla, the ulnar channels tend to terminate by joining into the axillary lymph node, particularly the lateral axillary lymph node. So when we talk about the axillary lymph nodes, one thing to remember is that the lateral axillary lymph node is the lymph node that tends to drain most fluid, most lymphatic fluid of the upper limb. And this is because the ulnar channel tends to drain directly into it. Some part of the ulnar channel may drain into minor lymph nodes that are not found at the arm. These are lymph nodes that are found very close to the elbow. This includes the cubital or supratrochlear lymph nodes found at the medial epicondyle. So we have some ulnar channel ending at that supratrochlear lymph node at the elbow, and we have most of them ending at the shoulder, the axilla, particularly at the lateral axillary lymph. For the radial channel or superficial lymphatic vessels, this would follow the superficial vein called the cephalic vein. Cephalic vein is found more laterally as it runs all the way up towards the arm. So the radial channel would also accompany the cephalic vein as it's ascending towards the arm. The radial channel, unlike the ulnar channel, tends to end at the apical axillary nodes. We'll talk about the axillary nodes very soon. Axillary nodes are five in number. We have one of them being the lateral axillary nodes, which receives the ulnar channel of superficial lymphatic vessels. Then we have the apical axillary lymph node that receives the radial channel. So radial channel lymphatic vessels will drain into the apical axillary lymph nodes. Some of the radial channel drains into an extra lymph node found very close to the deltopectoral region or triangle, and that is called the deltopectoral for the infraclavicular nodes. So the same way in which we have some ulnar channels draining into the supratrochlear lymph node, we have some radial channel draining into the infraclavicular lymph node. This is an image that shows not just the lymphatic vessels, but also some of the nodes. As you notice, you see that we have different numerous lymphatic vessels found within the upper limb, running from starting from the hands, running all the way up towards the shoulder. And you'd also notice that the superficial veins that we talked about in the model on venous drainage are also shown in this image. And like I said, the lymphatic vessels tend to accompany the superficial veins of the upper limb. So the um, lymphatic vessels originate from the hand and then ascend towards the forearm. At the forearm, you can split them into a radial bundle territory, or we call radial channel, and an ulnar bundle territory, or we call ulnar channel. Ulnar channel is found more medially and is going to accompany the basilic vein. The radial channel is found more laterally. It's going to accompany the cephalic vein. And in terms of how to terminate, remember that the ulnar bundle territory, the ulnar channels tend to run all the way up to the lateral lymph nodes. Lateral axillary lymph nodes are found somewhere around here. Some parts of the ulnar bundle tend to end at the cubital lymph node, what we call the supratrochlear lymph nodes. This is found at this point. In terms of the radial bundle tends to ascend together with the cephalic vein and tends to terminate at the apical axillary lymph node, somewhere around there. Right, and some portion of the radial bundle territory would end at a lymph node higher up called the infraclavicular lymph node. This is the infraclavicular lymph node located. What about the deep lymphatics? We have some lymph vessels found within the deep fascia. They're not found in the skin. So these are called the deep lymphatic vessels. They tend to accompany the deep veins of the upper limb. So the same way in which we have superficial lymphatic vessels accompanying the superficial veins of the upper limb, that's the basilic and the cephalic vein. We also have deep lymphatic vessels accompanying the deep veins of the upper limb. So veins that the radial vein, the ulnar vein, the brachial vein are accompanied by deep lymphatic vessels. They are much less numerous compared to the superficial vessels. So we have more superficial vessels compared to deep vessels, and most of the deep vessels would end in the axillary lymph nodes, either ending at the lateral axillary lymph node or ending at the central axillary lymph node. Like I said, most lymph or the upper limb tends to drain to the lateral axillary lymph node. And the reason is very simple. Lateral axillary lymph node will receive largely the ulnar channel of the superficial lymphatic vessels and also largely the deep lymphatic vessels. So it's receiving from both ends. So we have few lymph draining into central axillary lymph node, supratrochlear and infraclavicular lymph nodes. Now let's talk about the lymph nodes. Lymph nodes, like I said, are various junctions or sites in the lymphatic channel where we have lymph being filtered. So lymph nodes are very tiny circular structures that receive lymph, filter them, check for bacterial infection, check for abnormalities, and then once the lymph is clear, it can be passed on to a different lymphatic channel and move to a different lymph node. So lymph nodes tend to have vessels entering into them and vessels leaving them to allow for the continuous flow of lymph. The vessels that enter into the lymph node are usually called the afferent vessels, and the vessels that leave the lymph nodes are called the efferent vessels. Vessels that are entering will contain lymph that are not filtered yet, or partly filtered, whereas lymph nodes, the lymph vessels that are leaving the lymph nodes tend to be efferent. Efferent lymph nodes tend to contain lymph that are fully filtered or also partially filtered. Lymph nodes found in the upper limb tend to be three in number. We have the axillary lymph nodes, the intraclavicular lymph nodes, and the supratrochlear lymph nodes, running from proximal to distal. So the most distal is supratrochlear, followed by the axillary and the intraclavicular. We'll talk about each of them in the next slide. Supratrochlear lymph node is the lymph node found subcutaneously. It's found around the medial epicondyle. It's a lymph node that once it is inflamed, you can actually palpate it close to the medial epicondyle. It receives lymph from lymph vessels of the ulnar side of the forearm and the hand. Remember that lymphatic vessels around that ulnar side are called the ulnar channel or ulnar bundle territory, and they partly drain to the supratrochlear lymph node. So the afferent of the supratrochlear lymph node is coming from the ulnar channels of the superficial lymphatic vessels. Then the efferents of the supratrochlear lymph nodes will have to send efferents towards a different lymph node. And efferent of the supratrochlear lymph node goes directly to the lateral group of the axillary lymph node. So at the end of the day, that small amount of lymph that is being drained to the supratrochlear from the ulnar channel of the superficial lymphatic vessels would still end up being drained into the lateral group of axillary lymph nodes. And like I said, the lateral group of axillary lymph node receives the majority of lymph from the upper limb, filters it, and then eventually sends it off to other lymph in the body. The infraclavicular lymph node is a lymph node found directly at the deltopectoral groove. It's a lymph node that is found very close to the cephalic vein. This lymph node receives some lymph from the radial part of the arm, forearm, and the hand. Remember that when we're talking about superficial lymphatic vessels, we mentioned that we have two divisions, radial and ulnar. The radial channel tends to drain partly to the infraclavicular lymph node, and as a result, we have the infraclavicular lymph nodes draining lymph from the lateral part, the radial part of the arm, forearm, and the hand. After the infraclavicular lymph nodes filter the lymph, it would send this lymph through an efferent. Efferent from the infraclavicular lymph nodes ends up at the apical group of the axillary node. So most of the lymph would eventually stay under the axillary lymph node, particularly in the apical group. So if this is just to remember that and buttress the point that when we're talking about the radial branch or the radial channel of the structural lymphatics, some will drain into the infraclavicular and then most will drain into the apical. That some that will drain into the infraclavicular will still end up in the apical group of axillary lymph nodes. Then finally, let's end with talking about the axillary lymph nodes themselves. These are collections of 5 groups of nodes found in the axilla. We talked about the axilla in the module under the species of the upper limb. So we'll talk about the axillary lymph node, which is one of the contents of the axilla. Axillary lymph nodes are 5 in number. They receive different afferents from different points. They receive afferent from the upper limb. We talked about some of the lymph nodes or the axilla that are receiving afferent from the upper limb, like the apical and the lateral and the central. The apical receives from the superficial lymphatics on the radial side. The central receives from the deep lymphatics, and then the lateral will receive from both from the deep lymphatics and the superficial lymphatic on the ulnar side. Alongside the upper limb, we also have lymph coming from the chest wall and the breast, and this lymph then drain also into the axillary lymph node. So we talked only about 3 major axillary lymph nodes. The remaining 2 includes the anterior axillary lymph node and the posterior axillary lymph node, so what we call the pectoral nodes and the scapular nodes. These are the lymph nodes that would receive lymph from the breast and the chest wall. So we have 3 major lymph nodes, apical, central, and lateral receiving from the upper limb, largely lateral receiving from the upper limb. Then we have the remaining 2 receiving from elsewhere from other areas like the breast and the chest wall. In our module on the breast, we'll talk about the lymphatic drainage of the breast, which is a very important topic when talking about breast in relation to breast cancer and in relation to the spread of breast cancer. So lymph that is gotten from that is received by the axillary lymph nodes of the upper limb would eventually filter the lymph and drain it through an efferent lymphatic vessel. The efferent lymphatic vessel of the axillary lymph nodes draining the upper limb would eventually drain lymph into the supraclavicular lymph nodes. And then from the supraclavicular lymph nodes, difference is going to be taking the lymph towards the venous system, and that's how lymph will drain back into the systemic circulation. What are these axillary lymph nodes? We mentioned them already just to state what they are. They include the lateral axillary lymph node that drains largely most of the lymph in the upper limb. The anterior axillary lymph node, also called the pectoral nodes, which drains the breast. The posterior axillary lymph nodes, which is also called the scapular lymph node, that drains the posterior chest wall. The central lymph nodes and the apical lymph nodes also involved in draining the upper limb. This is an image of each of the lymph nodes. Yeah, you can see the lateral lymph nodes very close to the lower down, very close to the arm. So that's the reason why it's receiving most of the lymph because it's closer to the upper limb compared to the rest. Then we have the posterior lymph nodes, anterior lymph nodes, and then the central lymph nodes there. And then we have finally the apical lymph node that is found directly above. Then the infraclavicular lymph nodes we mentioned, which was found directly above. You can see the close proximity between the infraclavicular lymph nodes and the apical. That's the reason why we have most of the infraclavicular lymph nodes eventually joining into the apical nodes because of that close proximity that we see. The major clinical significance of lymphatics of the upper limb is what we call lymphadenopathy. Now, lymphadenopathy tends to be an abnormal swelling or enlargement of the lymph nodes, and this tends to mirror a couple of things. Like it could be as a result of an infection of the particular area where that lymph node is draining. It could also be as a result of spread of malignant cells, cancer cells to the lymph. So, in the case of the upper limb, if there's an infection of the upper limb, the lymph that is carrying the lymph vessel that is carrying the um, lymph will drain bacteria and drain microorganisms towards the lymph node. The lymph nodes, seeing this microorganism, would undergo inflammatory reaction and then as a result will swell. And that swelling is what we call lymphadenopathy. That's usually as a result of infection. So infection of the upper limb could lead to lymphadenopathy. Malignancies could also result into lymphadenopathy as a result of spread of cells, abnormal cells into the lymph nodes. This is commonly seen in breast cancer because the breast tends to be drained largely by the axillary lymph nodes. So, breast cancer, malignant cells from breast cancer could spread to the lymph nodes and lead to lymph swelling, particularly at the pectoral lymph nodes of the axilla. So this is just to show the drainage of the lymph in the upper limb to different lymph nodes here. One thing to notice is that whenever there's an infection of the upper limb, one of the signs could be a swollen lymph node. Usually the lateral lymph node will be swollen because it receives large amount of lymph from the upper limb. Alongside that, elsewhere around the chest wall, the breast, and then the anterior and posterior chest wall, infection around this site would also present with swollen lymph, or even malignancy. Cancer around this site would also present with swollen lymph nodes. So we can have a swollen central lymph node, a swollen anterior lymph node as a result of the malignancies of the breast or infections of the upper. That concludes our module on the lymphatics of the upper limb.